B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Yoma Daf Mem Zayin. We're going to start with the beginning of the next perek. And before we start this Mishnah, we're going to go back to the Mishnah on Daf Mem Gimel Amud Beis, the last Mishnah in the previous perek. It says there, Shochtoi, that the Kohen Gadol would shecht his bull, his par, v'kibel b'mizrak, as domoi, and he received the blood in a bowl. V'nosnei l'mishu mamaris, he gave it to somebody who was mamaris boy, who was going to stir it, ala reiv d'ravi shebeheichal, etc. And then not al machta va'olol reish hamizbeach, he went up to the top of the mizbeach, he took a shovel of coals, upina gecholim elech ve'elech v'choita min ha'ukolis ha'pnimiyes v'yorad v'nichal reiv d'ravi sheba'azora, he took a shovel full of coals that he was going to use for the ketores that was going to be brought in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And now we're up to the next stage of the Avodah. Before he's doing anything with the blood of the bull, he's now going to do the Avodah in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. The coals he's already taken off the Mizbeach from that special fireplace on the top of the big Mizbeach that was used. They took the coals from there for the ketores of Yom Kippur, according to many Mefarshim, and he's taken care of the coals now, but he now has to take care of the ketores themselves, the spices that were going to be burnt, the ketores, on the coals in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Says the Mishnah, they brought out from the chamber of the utensils, the Mlishkas HaKelim, Es HaKaf, the ladle, the spoon, that he was going to pour his cupped hands, his two hands were going to be full of, he was going to cup them in a big pile of ketores, take out a Meloi chofnov is two hands full, and he was going to pour it into this spoon. Ve'es hamachta, and they also brought out from the base of tinus, which is where the ketores was prepared, they brought out a shovel full, heaped full of ketores. Chofan, he scooped up Meloi chofnov, his cupped hands of ketores from this machta. V'nosan l'toich hakaf, and he put it into this ladle, the spoon. And says the Mishnah, Hagodol, a larger kohen, a kohen whose hands were larger, lefi godloi, then his cupped hands would have a larger measure of ketores, v'kotn lefi kotnoi, and a small kohen with smaller hands would have less ketores. V'kach hoisa midasa, and that was its measure. We're going to see in the Gemara a number of possible explanations for these three words. Continues the Mishnah, Notal es amachta. At this point, the Kohen Gadol, he took the shovel of coals that we spoke about on Daf Mem Gimel, b'yamino in his right hand, v'esakaf, and the spoon full of ketores, b'smoilo in his left hand, and that's as far as this Mishnah goes. And we're going to continue the Avodah in the next Mishnah on Daf Nun Aleph Amud Beis. It's going to tell us that Hoyo Mahalich Beheichal is going to tell us that he went into the Heichal, exactly how he walked through the Heichal into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. We'll see that on Daf Nun Aleph. Says the Gemara, Machta, it says Hoitziu Loi, so I explain the Mishnah as the Gemara is about to explain. But if you make a basic reading of the Mishnah, it seems Hoitziu Loi, they took out from the Lishkas HaKelim a kaf and the Machta, the spoon, and the machta, assuming this was the shovel that he was going to go into the Kodesh Kodashim with, the shovel with the coals. And the Gemara says, Machta, Tonole, we already learnt about this on Daf Mem Ches and on Daf Mem Gimel, that not ales hamachta, v'olo l'reish hamizbeach, v'choise, v'yored, that he went up on the mizbeach, and this was done before, we saw this on Daf Mem Gimel, that he shoveled some of the coals from the mizbeach, and had this shovel full and came down from the Mizbeach. And now we're ready a stage later. We're not going for that machta. Says the Gemara, you're right. Hasam, over there we're talking about machta de gecholim, the shovel of the coals. That's not what this Mishnah is talking about. V'hocha machta de ketores. Here we're talking about a shovel piled up with ketores from which the kohen was going to take a cupped handsful and put it into the kaf. The Tanya, as we learnt in the Brayso, Itziuloi, they brought out kaf reikon, an empty spoon, an empty ladle, milishkas hakelim, umachto gedusha, and piled up shovel shel Ketores full of Ketores milishkas Beis Avtinus, as we've seen previously in the Masechta, that lishkas Beis Avtinus, the Beis Avtinus chamber, is where they prepared the Ketores. So they would bring out for the Kohen Gadol a shovel full of Ketores from the lishkas Beis Avtinus. The Kohen would then take from that shovel a meloi chofnov, put it into the kaf, and then go with the kaf in his left hand, together with the coals in the shovel in his right hand, into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Continues the Gemara. Chofan, the Kohen, would scoop up meloi chofnov v'noisen l'teich hakaf hagodol lefi goydli v'akotn lefi katnui v'kach hoisa midasa. Quote from the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. Why do you need a kaf? Why do you need this ladle with which to take the Ketores into the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Why can't the Kohen just scoop up with his cupped hands, his two fistfuls, his two handfuls of Ketores, and go with them, with the Ketores in his hands, into the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Kaf b'yom HaKippurim lomoli meloi chofnov v'hevi omer achmona. What does it say in the Chumash? The pasuk says in Parshas Achreimos, v'lokach meloi amachto gach le'esh me'al hamizbeach melifnei Hashem u'meloi chofnov. You will take his hands full of Ketores samim dako, finely ground spices of the Ketores, v'hevi mi beis lapareiches, and he's going to take with his meloi chofnov of Ketores, he's going to bring it to the Kodesh HaKadoshim. It doesn't say in the pasuk you need a kli, a vessel, a kaf. Why do you need this kaf? Answers the Gemara mishum dolei efshar. You're right, the pasuk doesn't say you need this spoon, and later on we're going to see there may be halachic ramifications and possibly even leniencies, because according to the letter of the law, we shouldn't really have to need this kaf. The pasuk doesn't say you need it. However, you've got no choice. You have to use the kaf. Why? What are you going to do? How do we do the avodah of the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim? There was a shovel of coals. Onto the coals was placed the Ketores, and then the Ketores would get burnt on the coals. That was the avodah in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So we know that a shovel of coals has to be brought in. We know that 2 handfuls of Ketores have to be brought into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Dehecha navid, how are you going to do it? Na'ayel, are you going to go in once, v'hodor na'ayel, and then go in again? Once to take in the shovel of coals, and a second time to go in with your 2 hands full of Ketores? That can't be. Havo achas omer achmona v'lo ishtei havois. The pasuk just says once, v'hevi, you should bring in the coals and the Ketores at once into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. How are you going to bring the shovel of Ketores if you've got your 2 hands full of Ketores? How are you going to bring the shovel of coals if you've got your 2 hands full of Ketores? Are you going to suggest that nishkele l'Ketores b'chayfnov, fill up your 2 hands with Ketores, v'nochsei lemachta alo, and then put the shovel of the coals on top of that, on top of the Ketores on top of the hands holding the Ketores, v'leil, and then go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim that way? That would be a good idea, that you can also have your 2 hands full of Ketores and at the same time be able to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim with the coals, with a single entry into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. However, what are you going to do then? How are you going to put the coals, the shovel of coals, onto the floor of the Kodesh HaKadoshim in order to pour the Ketores on it? Kimoti Hasom, when you reach there, Heicha Levid, what are you going to do? Nishkele B'shina, you're going to use your teeth to remove that shovel of coals, v'nochse lemachta, and that's how you'll put that shovel down on the floor. Hashta lifnei melech bas of dam, even before a king of bas of Adam, of flesh and blood, ein oisin kain, it's inappropriate to use your teeth to put a utensil down. Lifnei melech malchei amlochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, before Hashem, the king of all the kings, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, alachas kama v'kama, it's even more so that it's inappropriate to do that. Hilkach, therefore, lo yefshe, you've got no choice. So we have to do something. Given delay efsha, what do you do? Of dinon kadashkachon b'nesim, in the parish of the Nesim, it says there's a concept of kaf achas meleo Ketores. We find a concept of a spoonful of Ketores over here, that we just have to find some way of getting the Ketores and the coals into the Kodesh HaKadoshim at the same time in an appropriate fashion. We have no choice but to take the 2 handfuls of Ketores and put it into a shovel, into a spoon, into a ladle, into this kaf, and that way bring it into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And we're going to see later that it could be that because The pasuk doesn't say that you need this vessel. It doesn't say it explicitly, and you've just, for no choice, you have to use one. It could be that afterwards the kohen would then re-pour the contents of this kaf back into his hands and pour from his hands onto the coals to conform with what it seems to be explicit in the pasuk. We're going to see that later on in the Gemara. Continues the Gemara. Not Yamini took the shovel of coals with his right hand, Ve'esakaf b'smoil, and the spoon of the Ketores in his left hand. Asks the Gemara, does it make sense that Yitziva, that the citizens should be ba'ara, should be on the ground, v'kiyura, and the strangers, the foreigners, b'shmei shemai, should be high in the heavens? Which is a way of asking that it doesn't make sense. The coals are there to serve the Ketores. The most important part is the Ketores. So why would you take the Ketores and put it in the left hand and the coals in the right hand? It should be the other way around. The right hand is the more prominent hand, is the one that should be taking the Ketores in. Answers the Gemara, Zu Meruba, because the gecholim, the coals, were 3 kav of coals, as we've learnt earlier on in the Masechta. V'zu, and the Ketores, generally speaking, is mu'etes, is much less. It's just two handsful, which is much less than the coals, and therefore the heavier shovel is brought in the right hand with the stronger hand, and the lighter shovel, the lighter spoon, is in the left hand. Even though it could be that you had a kohen with larger fists, and then the amount that the kohen of Ketores that would be similar to that of the coals, and sometimes there would even be like Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis, who would have 4 kav, even more Ketores. His hands were so big, he would have even more Ketores than coals. Nonetheless, since the majority of kohanim, most of the time, most years, the amount of Ketores was much less than that of the coals. Therefore, as a rule, the coals were taken in the right hand and the Ketores in the left hand. That's how Rashi seems to learn this Gemara, and Rashi seems not to be geirus the next 4 words, Zu Chama v'Zu Tzoinenes. Other Mefarshim, they actually ask a question, that a regular kohen who has less Ketores, then we understand that the larger and heavier coals should be in the right hand. But what about B'Sheshneim Shavim? In the event that the kohen is taking so much Ketores that it's similar to the amount of coals, or in the case of Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis, who was a Kohen Gadol who had even more Ketores than coals, how would we answer that? And according to that version in the Gemara, the answer would be Zu Chama v'Zu Tzoinenes. Since the coals are hot, they are taken in the right hand. Since the Ketores is cold, is taken in the left hand. But Rashi doesn't seem to have that girsa. Continues the Gemara. Omro al Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis. It was said about Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis, who was a Kohen Gadol, Shayachofen arba'as kavin. His 2 hands, the 2 handfuls, was the amount of Ketores was 4 kav of Ketores. That's how large his hands were. B'mloi chofnov, in his full cupped hands. Va'omer, and Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis, he would say, Kol hanoshim, regarding all other women, zordu. We'll soon see what this word means. V'zered ima, however, the zered of my mother, referring to himself, olo legag, was superior. Olo legag means went up on the roof, but it means was superior to that of all other women. What does that mean? Ikad omra ba'arson. They used to give people who are sick, who are not well, who needed strengthening, including pregnant women, they would give them a cereal called arson, discussed in other places in Shas. And he says all women, when they were pregnant, would have this arson. But the quality or the effect that the arson had on my mother and on the child she was carrying, namely me, Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis, was superior to that of all the other mothers and all the other kohanim. Arson. This cereal is yafa l'chayla. It helps to strengthen a weaker person. The Ikeda Amra, others say that this Zardu is not a type of cereal. The Gemara then Bracha says Zardon and Arson are the same type of cereal, just a different measure, a different way of preparing it. This Ikeda Amra, another version, says that this Zardu actually means B'shichva Zera, Ukdebavo, Derbavo, Rami. Rebavo asked a question. Ksiv in one pasuk it says in Shmuel, Vatazreini Chayel Lamilchama, which means that David HaMelech said, you girdled me with strength, lemilchama, for battle. Uchsiv, in a different pasuk it says, Vata'azreini chayil lemilchama, again, that you girdled me and gave me the strength for the war. So in one place it says, Vatazreini without an aleph, and in another pasuk in Tehillim there it says, Vata'azreini chayil with an aleph. And the Gemara explains, Omar David Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, David HaMelech was saying to Hashem, Ribono Shel Olam, Zereisoni. First, the first pasuk, Vatazreini, is coming from the root of Zora, which means to winnow, which means to separate the best and most choicest part from all others. That's Zereisoni. First, when you created me, I was created from the choicest part of the Shechva Zera. And afterwards, you've got the second word, Vata'azreini, whose root is Ezer, which means to girdle and to give me strength. V'ziraztoni, you girdled me and you gave me the strength to go out to war. So you see that there's such a concept of the choicest part of the Zera being used, and the same as David HaMelech said, Zerisoni, and that's why he said Vatazreini without the Aleph, and that's what Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis said when he said that Zered Ima Oila Lagag. Omro Lova Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis was said about him, about Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis, that Pamachas at one point Siper Dvorim, he was speaking in Arabi with an Arabi Echad Bashuk with an Arab in the marketplace. On Yom Kippur, the Mefarshim discuss what on earth is a Kohen Gadol doing in the marketplace on Yom Kippur. He's supposed to be in the Beis HaMikdash doing the Avodah. It was obviously a very important matter that had to be taken care of. V'nitzeh, and he spat, this Arab spat tzinoira, some saliva mipiv from his mouth al begodov onto the clothes of the Kohen Gadol, and he became Tomei. V'nichnas yeshevav ochiv. This Rabbi Shmuel had a brother who was the deputy, the scan, and he had to take his place to carry on the avodah. The Shemesh Tachtov, and he served the Yom Kippur avodah in the place of Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis. V'rasa Imon, and their mother Kimchis saw that year Shnei Kohanim Gedolim, two of his sons were both Kohanim Gedolim, b'yom echad, in one day. V'shuv Amru, another incident happened. Amru alav Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis, who was the Kohen Gadol, the Pamachas Yotzov Sipir im Hegmoin Echad. He had to go out again to speak to some officer, Bashuk, in the marketplace, and again, V'nitzot Tzinoira Mipiv al Begodov, some saliva came from the mouth of this guy onto his clothes, and he became Tomei. V'nichnas Yosef Ochiv, and Yosef, his brother, took his place for Shemesh Tachtov and served on Yom Kippur in his place. V'ra'as Imon, and their mother, again, this Kimchis, saw Shnei Kohanim Gedolim b'yom echad, two of her sons who were Kohanim Gedolim on the same day. Tonu Rabbanon, Shiva Bonim Hoyu Lo LeKimchis. Kimchis had 7 sons. V'kuron Shimshu B'kuna Gedolah, and all of them served as Kohanim Gedolim. And it doesn't mean that one died and therefore the next one took over. That would not be a praise. Tosei Shonim, he explains that obviously incidents similar to those mentioned above happened, that during her lifetime she saw all her 7 sons serving as Kohanim Gedolim. Amru lo Chachamim, the Chachamim asked Kimchis, Ma osis, what did you do, shezachis lekach, that you merited to such a thing, that all your 7 sons will be Kohanim Gedolim? Amru lehem, she said to the Chachamim, Miyomai, all my days, leirou kairas beisi, the beams of my home didn't see, kil a saori, the braids of my hair. Whenever appropriate, I would make sure that my hair was fully covered. And Rashi brings here from the Yerushalmi that there's a pasuk that says, "Kol kvuda bas melech pnima," the honor of the daughter of a princess is to be inside. Mimishpetzois zav levusha, that comparing her to very fine golden clothes. That from there we learn, the Yerushalmi says that Isha Tznuah, a modest woman who knows that her place is in the home, is deserving that she should have Kohanim Gedolim who are wearing the golden clothes. Amra, the Chachamim said, Harbe asu kein v'lo ho'ilu. That it's interesting because there were other women that were also tried to be careful that the beams of their homes shouldn't see the hair. Even inside the homes, the hair was covered all the time, and nonetheless they didn't merit this. Continues the Gemara. Tonu Rabbanon. And now in the next Gemara, we have to make sure not to get confused between two similar concepts but very different. We know that whenever a kohen mincha was brought, then a koimetz, which is a single fistful, it's not even a whole fist, is 3 fingers of one hand that would take part of the mincha, the korban mincha, and take away, it's called a koimetz, put it into a kli sharis, and then it would go onto the mizbeach, and the rest of the korban mincha was called shirayim, the remnants, and would be eaten by whoever was supposed to eat the korban mincha. That's called a koimetz, where we separate 3 fingers of one hand of the mincha. And then we've got a similar concept, which is what we're discussing here, where you've got a cupped hands, which is 2 hands full of ketores that was taken from this shovel full of ketores and was then taken into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. The Gemara says as follows. Bekum tzoi. And now we're going to start by talking about the koimetz. It says Vahirim imenu bekum tzoi misailes hamincha, that in the parasha where it says that you take a koimetz of the korban mincha, it says the word bekum tzoi with his fist. Shelo yaseh Mida lekoimetz. Don't make a type of a utensil which is the same size as the contents of 3 fingers of this kohen, and then whenever you need to do a koimetz, instead of doing it with your hands, use this made-to-measure utensil. No, the pasuk says bekum tzoi with his fist. Yeah, he has to do it with his own hand. He has to remove the koimetz. So with the koimetz, there's no discussion. It's got to be with the hand of the kohen, with the kohen. The question is, Mao sheyaseh mida lechafina, regarding the chafina, which is the maloi chofnov, the cupped hands of the kohen gadol taking the ketores. Does he have to do it with his hands, or could you prepare a type of utensil that contains exactly the same amount of ketores as his cupped hands would, and use that instead? Or do you have to use your hands? It doesn't say in the Torah bechoifnoi like it says bekum tzoi. That was the question of the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Hasam, and the Gemara is now explaining over there by the koimetz hu dechsiv bekoimte. It says bekoimte. Aval hacha, but in the case of the maloi chofnov, the loiksiv bechofnov. It doesn't say explicitly bechofnov with his hands. It just says maloi chofnov. You should have fistfuls, handsfuls of ketores taken to the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Maybe there you don't need that it's done with his hands, as long as you have the right measure. In this case, you don't need it doesn't have to be done with his hands. Or maybe no. Yalif molei or moloi from moloi mikumtzoi. It says regarding the moloi chofnov, it says velokach moloi hamachta. And it says Maloi Chofnov, sorry. He's got to take Maloi Chofnov Ketores Samim. And then it says regarding the koimetz, it says Maloi Kumtzoi in the pasuk. And since it says Maloi Kumtzoi and it says Maloi Chofnov, we're going to make a Gzeira Shava Maloi. And the same way as it says Be Kumtzoi, it's as if it says Be Chofnoi, it has to be with his fists. Or maybe not, that was the question. Do we say this Gzeira Shava or not? Tashma, we're going to try and bring proof. What does it say in our Mishnah? After it tells us that a big kohen had, with bigger fists, with bigger hands, had a larger measure of ketores, and a smaller kohen had a smaller measure, the Mishnah says v'kach hoisami dasa, and that was its measure. My love, can we not assume that these 3 words in the Mishnah mean sheim rotzo lasis mida acheres oisa, that if you want to make a measure, the word acheres is, the Bach says, is out of place here, but if you want to make a utensil, a vessel that will contain the same measure as this kohen, that suffices. So then we have an explicit proof from the Mishnah that we don't say maloi, and that regarding the maloi chofnov, you're allowed to do it with a kli. That was the question, or with the proof that the Gemara tried to bring from our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, loi, you don't have proof from our Mishnah. Because it could be that the Mishnah means something else. When it says it means that in the same way as he used his fists, his 2 hands, to remove the ketores, to select, to scoop up the ketores from the big shovelful and put it into this spoon and take the spoon into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. When you went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, he would then again do the same thing. He would pour from this spoon back into his hands. And that's what it means, v'kacho isomidasa, that the same thing would happen in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Says the Gemara, if that's how you're learning the Mishnah, Shamas Minah, so do you then have proof from our Mishnah regarding a question that the Gemara is going to ask on Daf Mem Tes Amud Aleph, Chayfen v'chayzer v'chayfen. This was a question. Does the Kohen have to again pour the Ketores into his hands before pouring onto the coals or not? And that was a question in the Gemara. So are you saying that from this Mishnah there's proof that indeed you do have to do that? Says the Gemara, no, you cannot bring proof from the Mishnah either way. It could be the Mishnah means that you can use a utensil. It could be that the Mishnah means that you have to re-pour the Ketores into his hands. And it could even mean means it's something entirely different. It could be a means, make sure that it's an exact measure, not more and not less. And since the Mishnah could mean any of these three things, you don't have proof for any of them. Dilma maybe, maybe the Mishnah is coming to tell us that you can use a kli and you don't need to do it with your hands. Maybe the Mishnah is coming to tell us you have to take an exactly full 2 handfuls of the cupped hands of Ketores, not more and not less, as we'll see later in the Gemara. And it could be that the Mishnah means that you have to be chayfen v'chayzer v'chayfen. So you have no proof either way from our Mishnah. And so we've more or less left with a question, do we say maloi maloi, or do we not say maloi maloi? It's a question the Gemara hasn't resolved here, and the Gemara is actually later on going to revert back to this and say that a future question is dependent on this question. Continues the Gemara Tonu Rabbanon. It says in the Pasuk, V'hevia el bnei Aaron akeanim v'komatz misham maloi kumtzoi miselto, that we're again talking about the kumtzoi of the fistful or the 3 fingers of a handful of Ketores. So what does it say what do we learn from Maloi Kumtzoi? We learn Yachel Mevurutz. If we'll just say Maloi Kumtzoi, his hands full of the mincha, the korban mincha that he's taking a kometz from, I may have thought Mevurutz, even when it's overflowing. Talmud Loma, that's what it says back in the pasuk we saw before. V'heirim imenu bekumtzoi. Bekumtzoi means exactly bekumtzoi, not overflowing. If you'd only say bekumtzoi, Yochel, I may have thought b'roshet b'osav, you'll just take it as little as possible. Just a tiny bit of the mincha will be the kometz, and not more than that. The less the better, says Rashi. Talmud Loma, that's why it says maloi kumtzoi. No, take a full kometz. Kometz meaning the 3 fingers. You take the 3 middle fingers of his right hand, not overflowing, but not less either. That's what you learn from bekumtzoi. So from this bekumtzoi, we've already learned from the same word 2 things. Number 1, you have to do it with his fist. He cannot do it with a utensil. Number 2, it has to be a full kometz. So what do we learn from here, from bekumtzoi? That it has to be kedekomtzi inshi. You have to do a regular scooping like normal people would scoop up. How would you do that? He puts his hands from the sides of his hands, the sides of his hands, starting with the little finger, straight into the mincha. He then closes shalosh etzba'osav, the middle 3 fingers, al pisas yodai, over the palm of his hand, the kometz, and he scoops up. So when it's just the type of korban mincha, which is just flour, just virtue of doing that, whatever's in the 3 fingers will stay in there. Anything that's bulging will just fall off. However, ubemachavas, ubemarcheshes, the type of mincha that before doing the kometz, it was fried. It's either in a machavas, in a flat pan, or in a marcheshes, in a deep pan. And there it was much more complicated to do that because there's the parts of the mincha is not fine flour. It's already been broken up, fried, and so to almost baked and fried pieces of of mincha, which were then crumbled up again, much bigger pieces. And you can't just, those pieces sticking out from the second and fourth finger, you can't just remove them altogether because then it will be lacking. You have to keep the pieces in between his three fingers and break off whatever's protruding using the thumb and the little finger. Moichak, he's got to smooth it out, begoidle with his thumb milamaila from on top, ube'etzboi ktano, and with his little finger milamata. And this was the very difficult avodah service in the Beis Hamikdash. Is this the only hard avodah in the Beis Hamikdash? Is doing the komet on a machavas and marcheshes? Says the Gemara, v'suloi, no more. V'ha'ika malika. What about malika? It was very difficult. It was difficult to do malika, which is a type of shlita, not done with a knife, but it's the way they did shlita on a bird using the thumbnail, and that was also a hard avodah. V'ha'ika chafina. There was a scooping up the handful of the Ketores. We're going to learn on Daf Mem Tes Amud Beis that it was also a difficult avodah. So why are you saying here that doing the kometz of a mincha was hard, as if it's the only hard thing in the Beis Hamikdash? No. What we meant to say was it's one of the more challenging avodas in the Beis Hamikdash, but not the only one. So that's what the Gemara says from here. For that we learn from Maloi Kumtsoi and from Bekumtsoi, you've got to do it normally. Not just a little bit, not overflowing, not too much. It's got to be a regular Bekumtsoi, 3 fingers full. And we're going to see later on in the Gemara, exactly what, at the bottom of this Omud, what's included and excluded in this. Continues the Gemara, Omer Rabbi Yechanan. Boyer Rabbi Yeshua ben Uzah. Rabbi Yeshua ben Uzah asked the following question. Now, when a person would typically put his hands into a mincha, into flour, and to take the 3 fingers full of his fist for the kometz that would then go on the base on the mizbeach, then inevitably there's going to be some flour in between his fingers which he didn't intend to scoop up even. They were just there by virtue of the fact that that's what happens when you scoop up the flour. Bein habinaim shel maloi kumtzoi. When he takes this maloi kumtzoi, his fistful, the 3 fingers full, and there's a little bit of the mincha, the flour, in between his fingers. Mau, what's the halacha? Is it considered as part of the kometz, which has to go on the Beis Hamikdash, onto the mizbeach, or is it considered as part of the shirayim, the remnants, what's left over of the mincha, which has to be eaten, not to be allowed to be put on the mizbeach? Omer of Papa said as follows: the gavoi, the parts that are between the fingers but can be seen, so to speak, from the inside, loite boilecha. That's not a question. The vadai kometz. So of course it's part of the kometz. The baroi, the parts that's sticking out that you can see from the outside, loite boilecha. That's also not a question. The vadai shirayim. Of course it's considered as part of the remnants. It's not part of the flour that's supposed to be part of the kometz to go on the mizbeach. Kitaboy. When am I questioning? The beina, when it's exactly between the fingers, they cannot be seen from the inside and not from the outside. Is it kometz? Is it shiraim? Omer Rabbi Yechanan, who told us that Rabbi Yeshua ben Uzah had this question, he says, Hadar Pashta Yeshua ben Uzah. Rabbi Yeshua ben Uzah actually, he himself resolved this question. That beina binaim is sofik ninu. It actually has the status of a doubt, of a sofik. Maybe it's shiraim, maybe it's kometz. So what do? We have a challenge here. A kometz goes on the mizbeach, shiraim has to be eaten. What do you do with the flour in between his fingers? Heicha ovid, what do you do? Omer of Chanina said as follows: Maktir kometz lechudei tchila. First, you take the kometz on its own, which is only what was inside the fingers, not between the fingers. You put it into a kli, and that is the kometz, and you put it on the mizbeach on its own. V'hodar beina binaim, and afterwards you add on the bits of flour that was between his fingers. You put that on the mizbeach separately. And why do you have to do this? De'i omras bein habinaim bereisha, because if you're going to first offer up onto the mizbeach the parts of the flour that were in between his fingers, Dilma Shiraim Ninu. We said it was a doubt, it was a suffix. In the event that it's considered Shiraim, it's considered the remnants of the Kometz, it's considered as part of the Mincha, not part of the Kometz, what's going to happen then? That means that when you actually put the rest of the Kometz onto the Mizbeach, the remains of the Mincha is lacking, because in the event that the bits in between his fingers are considered the remainders, they're considered the Shiraim, they're now been burnt on the Mizbeach, they're no longer Shiraim. Dilma Shiraim Ninu. Maybe the flour between his fingers are considered Shiraim. V'havalu Shiraim shechosru. And now what will have transpired is that the Shiraim, the overall Shiraim, which is the whole Mincha excluding the Kometz, is now lacking, is missing. Shechosru bein Kmitza l'Aktorah, between taking away, separating the Kmitza and putting the Kometz on the Mizbeach, it will have been missing, because you put that flour onto the Mizbeach before putting the Kometz on the Mizbeach. And therefore you cannot put the flour from between his fingers onto the Mizbeach before you put the Kometz on. And we know the halacha is that Shiraim shechosru bein Kmitza l'Aktorah, if there's anything lacking from the Shiraim between the time you do the Kmitza and the time you put the Kometz on the Mizbeach, ein maktir aleim l'sa Kometz, then it's possible you're not allowed to put the Kometz onto the Mizbeach anymore. And therefore you first put the Kometz on, and then you're safe. And now maybe the bits in between his fingers are also considered Kometz, you'll put that on afterwards. And in the event that the Shiraim, that the bits in between his fingers are not the Kometz, is considered Shiraim, so you've put the Shiraim on the Mizbeach after the Kometz. Let's assume that that's okay. The Gemara is now going to ask that it's not okay. If so, hashtanami, even now, with what you're saying, that you first put the kometz on the Mizbeach, and only then you put the flour of between his fingers on the Mizbeach, you'd have transgressed here the halacha of kol shemimenu leishim, any part of a korban, that part of it was supposed to be put on the Mizbeach and was put on the Mizbeach, harehu, whatever's left over, bebal taktiru, you're not allowed to put it on the Mizbeach. For example, a korban chatos, once the fats went on the Mizbeach, you're not allowed to put any other parts of the chatos onto the Mizbeach. Also with the mincha, once you've put the ktoires, once you've put the kometz onto the Mizbeach, you're not allowed to put any of the shiraim on the Mizbeach. So here, what does it help to put the kometz on the Mizbeach first, and then put the shiraim on? You're not allowed to put the shiraim on. In the event that the flour between his fingers is called shiraim, you're not allowed to put that on the Mizbeach. It's bebal taktiru. It's learnt out from a pasuk. The pasuk says, "Lo saktiru mimenu ishel Hashem," that anything that part of it was put on the Mizbeach, you're not allowed to put any of the shiraim on the Mizbeach. Answers the Gemara, Omer Rabbi Yehuda Breid Reb Shimon ben Pazi, I've got a solution. The maktir le l'shum eitzim, that when you'll take, after you put the kometz onto the Mizbeach, you'll take the flour that was between his fingers, and you'll say as follows, you'll make a condition. You'll say, if the status of this flour is part of the kometz, I'm adding it to the kometz on the Mizbeach. In the event that it's shiraim, I'm not allowed to put it on the Mizbeach to be part of a reach nichoyach, which is a term used for korbanos, a satisfying aroma, that you're not allowed to do. But I can put the shiraim on the Mizbeach with the intentions of it should just be added firewood, so to speak. I'm adding to the eitzim, to the woods. That you can do, Kadir Rabbi Eliezer. Like Rabbi Eliezer said, Rabbi Eliezer was actually talking about the limbs of a korban chatos that are not allowed to go on the Mizbeach. After the fats were put on the Mizbeach, that's it. The korban chatos is eaten. What happens if the limbs of the korban chatos got mixed up with limbs of a korban oila? That the limbs of the korban oila have to be put on the Mizbeach. What do we do now? We don't know which ones are oila, which ones are chatos. So Eliezer says that even though you're not allowed to put the limbs of a korban chatos onto the Mizbeach, because, as we said before, lo saktiru mimenu, you're not allowed to. However, over here, in order to avoid it, having to throw all the limbs away, and because maybe it's oila, and oila has to go on the Mizbeach, and saying the whole thing is possible, What Rabbi Eliezer said was, Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, L'reach nechech yatamale. You're not allowed to put these limbs onto the mizbeach, so to speak, as a reach nechech, as a satisfying aroma. Avolat l'shum eitzim. You are allowed to put them up as added wood, so to speak. And then the person who puts the limbs that have got confused on the mizbeach says as follows: if this is the oilo limbs, it should be l'reach nechech. If it's the chatos, it should be le'etzim. It should just be as if it's extra wood. The same will say here, that the flour between his fingers, if they're koimets, it's fine. It has to go on the mizbeach. If it's shirayim, then it will serve as wood. Says the Gemara, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that works. Elo l'Rabbanon, according to the Rabbanon, who say that over there in the case of the chatos and the oilo, they got mixed up. You're not allowed to put it on the mizbeach and the whole thing gets lost. What are you going to say? They don't say that you can put something on the mizbeach, even though it seems that you're transgressing the kol shemimenu leishim, that lo saktiru mimenu, and you can get around that by doing it l'shum eitzim, in the name of wood. According to the Rabbanon, that you cannot say that. What are you going to do here? Omer of Mary says, you have no choice. We have to try and make sure that the kohen who takes the koimetz should be the komtzi shmeini. It should be a kohen who's got quite fat fingers, and then the flesh of his fingers are very tightly together in a way that there's no flour will be stuck between his fingers, and then we'll have avoided the issue. Says the Gemara, once you've come to such a solution, Rabbi Eliezer Nami, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, lekatchila, the best should be lekatchila, the komtzi shmeina, that such a kohen who will not get into this problem should do the koimetz in order to avoid this problem. Even though according to Rabbi Eliezer, you're allowed to make this condition and put it on as if it's eitzim onto the mizbeach, but it's only b'di'eved, you shouldn't do it lekatchila. And the Mirz Hashem, in the next share, we're going to continue from here.